Hello, in this video I'm going to be talking about the parts of the heart, and I'm going to be drawing two different diagrams, actually three different diagrams with you today to kind of describe the parts of the heart and how the blood flows through it. So before we begin, I just want to mention that if you see anything in red in this video, that means that it is describing blood that's oxygenated, which just means that it has high amounts of oxygen. If you see anything in blue, that means that the blood is deoxygenated or it has low amounts of oxygen or high amounts of carbon dioxide. Now, I'm using these different colors to describe so you can kind of differentiate between the two things, but that does not mean that your blood is red if it has lots of oxygen and blue if it does not have oxygen in it. It is just a description for the diagram's purpose. Your blood has a slightly different reddish tinge depending on if it's oxygenated or deoxygenated. So it's kind of more deep purpley red if it's deoxygenated, and it's more of like an orangey bright red if it's oxygenated. I also want to mention that if I say artery, that means that it's a vessel that's taking blood away from the heart, and a vein is talking about taking blood towards the heart. So just wanted to mention in these pictures that I'm going to be going through with you, you might notice that you're going to seem like the left and the right is on the opposite side. So all of these diagrams that I'm showing you is as if I was looking at someone else's chest that's standing in front of me. So their left side would be right here, okay, which is actually on your right side because they're mirror image to you. Their right side is on this side. So in all of the diagrams, you'll notice that the left side is here and the right side is here. I'm not doing it backwards. It's because you're looking at someone's chest as if they were standing in front of you, facing the opposite direction as you. So I'm going to start with drawing what I like to call the box diagram heart. This is to help you just understand the vessels and the parts of the heart without having it so complicated with what it actually looks like. So I'm going to use the analogy that your heart is like a building with 4 rooms. And these rooms have hallways and doors that lead in and out of it and connect some of the rooms together. So if I was talking about these 4 rooms, like in the heart, you have 4 chambers. The chambers or the room's name would be the right atrium and then the right ventricle. Again, remember this is the right side, opposite of what you have in your heart because you're looking at someone else's heart. And then on the other side of this wall, that separates the two sides of the heart, you have the left atrium and the left ventricle. So these are like the rooms in our heart that are connected by vessels and which I would call hallways, and doors, which I would be referring to the valves that are separating the two different. So these are doors, which are valves. This is a door, which is a valve. This is a hallway or a vessel leading into the heart, and then this is a vessel leading out of the heart. So I'm going to go through and talk about the different structures that blood goes through. I always pick the exact same spot to start every single diagram of the heart because every single diagram is going to look slightly different, but you still need to know how to label it. And I always start with one part of the heart and go through the order of blood flowing through it. So it also is kind of helping me remember that order and make sure that I'm not making silly mistakes as I'm labeling it. So we're going to start in the top part here going into the right atrium. The hallway or the vessel that leads into the right atrium is called the vena cava. You're going to notice that it's blue right now because the blood is deoxygenated because the vena cava comes from the entire body and leads back into the heart so we can eventually send it to our lungs. So we have deoxygenated blood right now that's moving through the right side of our heart. So the right atrium walls are made up of muscle and they'll squeeze and push the blood down through the tricuspid AV valve, which now means that we're in the right ventricle. The right ventricle walls will squeeze and send the blood down again through the pulmonary semilunar valve. So the pulmonary semilunar valve is the actual door opening up into this hallway. The hallway's name itself is called the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery leads to our lungs. Pulmonary is like a fancy word for lungs. So anytime you see that word, it's talking about going either to the lungs or from the lungs. So in the lungs, we do gas exchange. We'll take a deep breath in and get a lot of oxygen in that breath to put into the blood, and we'll take a deep breath out and take out all of the carbon dioxide that's built up in our blood and exhale it so that it goes into the air. So once we have that gas exchange occurring in the lungs, our blood is now going to be red because it's oxygenated now, and it's going to travel back to our heart on the left side this time, traveling through the pulmonary vein. So the pulmonary vein goes into the left atrium. The left atrium will squeeze, sending the blood down through the bicuspid AV valve. And Then the left ventricle wall will squeeze, sending the blood down through the aortic semilunar valve, which is the doorway leading into the hallway. The hallway's name is actually the aorta. The aorta is a massive blood vessel that runs kind of on top of our heart and then down, basically all the way down our spine and goes to all of our different organs, and then eventually splits off into two sections that go down into our legs. So it's huge, massive blood vessel that's about the size of a garden hose. So the aorta is sending our blood to our body. And in our body, the cells need to take the oxygen into it, and will actually put the carbon dioxide that they've been building up in the cells as they're doing certain cellular processes called cellular respiration, and we'll put that carbon dioxide in the blood so it can transfer back to the heart and then eventually to the lungs and be exhaled again. So now we're back to deoxygenated blood, and we go back to the heart, to the vena cava, and it can do that kind of figure eight motion over and over and over and over and over and over again. And that's basically what our heart is doing and our blood vessels are doing constantly for your entire life. So this is a really simplified diagram, and I make it look a little bit different to kind of start off with so that you can kind of learn the names and see the general flow of the blood, but the heart doesn't actually look like this. It's a lot more complicated. So I drew it so that it looks like the blood comes in on the top and goes out the bottom. But unfortunately, the blood comes in the top and also gets pushed out the top as well. So it comes in and then get pushed up. So it's actually way more complicated and looks a little bit more like this. So the actual heart, it looks like this. It's obviously way more complex than my last picture. So let's label this picture. And again, I always start in the exact same spot. I always start with the vena cava. In reality, we actually have two different branches of the vena cava. So we're going to label both of those branches. So number 2 is what we call the superior vena cava. Superior just means on top. And we also have the inferior vena cava, which is number 10. Both of those things are leading into our right atrium. So we have blood coming in here and also blood coming in here, going into the right atrium, which is number 7. The right atrium leads through the tricuspid AV valve, so it'd be going through here into the right ventricle, and the right ventricle will get squeezed the walls and pushed up through this section to number 6, which is the pulmonary semilunar valve, and then blood will travel through this section right here. So number 4 is called the pulmonary trunk. That was not on the last diagram, and in fact won't be on some of your diagrams that you're going to see in the future. It just happens to be a label on this diagram. So the pulmonary trunk is just the section of pulmonary artery before it actually branches into the right and the left pulmonary artery, which eventually lead to the lungs, and we do gas exchange at our lungs. So then we come back to our left side of the heart using the left and right pulmonary veins, which both kind of go behind the heart and lead into this section right here, number 16, which is the left atrium. The left atrium wall will squeeze, send the blood down through number 14, which is the bicuspid AV valve, into number 13, which is the left ventricle. So now we're down here. Again, the walls will squeeze and send the blood up through number 15, which is the aortic semilunar valve, and we'll go up kind of behind that pulmonary trunk into the ascending aorta, which branches into our arms and our neck. And then it goes down behind our heart through number 11, which is called the descending aorta. And then we have just one more label, which is the wall that separates the two sides of the heart, the left from the right, and it's called the septum. So the septum is the complete division between the two sides to make sure that we don't have oxygenated and deoxygenated blood mixing. So that's what the actual diagram of the heart looks like. Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated, but it will just take a little bit of practice to learn the names. I promise it isn't impossible. You just have to take a little bit of time to practice. So now I'm going to go through and just go through those names again and just draw some arrows on the heart so that you guys can see the blood flow through the heart that I was kind of going through with the mouse. So starting on the superior and inferior vena cava going into the right atrium. Right atrium will squeeze, sending through the tricuspid AV valve into the right ventricle. And then the right ventricle will squeeze, sending the blood up through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, and then out the left and the right pulmonary artery. So this would obviously be going behind this vessel and behind this vessel. I just unfortunately can't really do that on a picture. Take it a little bit more patience. So you can just draw it behind, or if you want to draw it on top, it doesn't really matter. So then we're at the lungs. The lungs are doing gas exchange to make sure that we're getting rid of all of that carbon dioxide that's built up in our deoxygenated blood and put a bunch of oxygen in. So we have lots of oxygen there. So then we're in the lungs and we're going to go back to the heart because now our blood is all oxygenated. We're going to go through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. The left atrium is going to squeeze, sending blood through the bicuspid AV valve. And now we're in the left ventricle. Now the left ventricle will squeeze, sending blood through the aortic semilunar valve and then up through the ascending into our neck and arms and down the descending aorta, which goes into our stomach and our liver and all of our different organs, our intestines, and eventually into our legs. So that is kind of how the blood flows through the heart. Again, a little bit more complicated than the first diagram. So let's go back and just label just the names and kind of where blood starts. So again, I always start with the vena cava. So the vena cava, the superior and the inferior vena cava go into the right atrium, which then go through the tricuspid AV valve and through the right ventricle, through the pulmonary semilunar valve, into the right and left pulmonary artery, to the lungs. We do gas exchange, so now we're deoxygenated blood, into the pulmonary veins that go to the left atrium, through the bicuspid AV valve, to the left ventricle, which then goes through the aortic semilunar valve to the ascending and descending aorta, which eventually goes to the body and then leads back eventually through the vena cava. And we just keep going through that circle over and over and over and over again. So that is the 3 different diagrams of the blood flow through the heart. Again, it seems really complicated and like a lot right now, but I promise as you move forward, it will make a little bit more sense. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. If not, please feel free to ask me any questions that you have, and talk to you guys later.